If you followed my keyboard journey over the last couple of years or just over the last few months, you know that I'm quite smitten by my split. But as we all know, rabbit holes can be numerous and bottomless, and just when you thought you found your perfect match, something else pops up. To me, that were open source keyboards. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me briefly attempt an explanation. In the grand world of computer peripherals, there's the big names we're all familiar with, the slightly more niche brands, the custom space, which can have quite big inhabitants as well, and the ergonomic space. Here as well, there are bigger and smaller companies fighting over your individual fingertips. From the impressions that I've gotten, the last one feels like the smallest in terms of actual products being released, at least compared to the rest, but not the smallest by the size and enthusiasm of the community. Now, there are companies making ergonomic and split keyboards, plenty even, but there's also a large amount of individuals and teams that have even created their own designs and are providing the blueprints to these for anyone to download, tinker, and modify, aka open sourcing it. Now, this video won't cover that part just yet, that still seems too daunting to me, but instead attempts to answer the question I've had in my head ever since I first came across this. How does one actually go about downloading a keyboard and then having it made? Well, if this bugged you too, or if you just want to see a fool attempting to use his last remaining brain cells for a final hooray, this one's for you. Just for your convenience, this video is split up into 3 parts: finding the right keyboard, getting the parts, which includes having them made, and lastly putting everything together. Feel free to skip around using the markers in the timeline below, or stay right here so you can witness my slow descent into madness over the next 15 to 20 minutes. Anyway, let's begin with the most crucial question of all: which keyboard shall it be? There were plenty of options, but I ultimately settled on the Totem by Geist, who's made some amazing designs, with this one being one of the more popular ones, and to me, the most intriguing. But before we continue, you might ask yourself how I came across the Totem. Well, apart from the usual suspects of watching one too many YouTube videos and doom scrolling through my Instagram feed to decide what my next financial misstep would be, I have found a few other spaces that might help you pick out a board. One of them is a site called golem.hu. They offer a handy little database focused on ergonomic keyboards, accompanied by photos, which is great for people like me that prefer ordering food from restaurants that operate the same way. Apart from the database though, the site also provides some great reading material on how to build your own keyboard and much more information on custom keyboards in general. Lastly, they also have a great newsletter, which I would highly recommend signing up for. It's a great way to passively stay in the loop about new designs. Alternatively, you can also subscribe to their RSS feed. Just for the record, I'm not affiliated with them and have never spoken to anyone who's involved. I just really like the website and what they're doing. Then there's a list by Yellow Afterlife with a heck of a lot of filter options, so you can narrow down your preferences even further to find what you're looking for. If you need images on this one too, you can simply activate them in the filter settings. I ended up using neither of these, as I already knew about the Totem through the fantastic YouTube channel Aiga. I'll link it and a couple of other ones that are worth a subscribe down below. There's probably way more places to discover open source keyboards, but for now I think this is enough to start with. But as always, if you'd like to share a good source, feel free to drop a comment. I'd love to learn more about this myself. Anyway, as mentioned, I went with the Totem and we're about to continue with the procurement of its parts, but I wanted to touch on the subject of keycaps just before we head there. Because yes, there are open source keycaps as well. However, I couldn't find a similar database to filter through, so this one involves a bit of Googling or searching on Reddit. To help you along the way, I linked 2 of my favorites, including the one that I ended up using down in the description below. In the end, my project may seem almost a little boring, as I believe many chose the Totem and Lame, or however you pronounce the caps, combination, but for my first attempt I wanted to make sure everything would work well together. What I did not account for was the skill required, but we'll talk about that later. For now, let's continue with one of the most fun pastime activities one can have: spending money that you shouldn't. To make things easier, let's split this into 3 subchapters. First, let's talk about all the internal parts, like the microcontroller and the screws. Second, everything that has to be manufactured, that includes the PCB, case, and the keycaps if you choose to go that route. And lastly, the switches and any other accessories that you might need, but this of course heavily depends on your build. If you successfully picked a board from all the offerings out there will most likely be a build guide somewhere on the accompanying GitHub page. Using the Totem as our example again, we can find it in the documents folder as buildguide.md. The location and level of detail of this can vary between projects of course, so This isn't an exact guide that will work for every board out there, but it should be enough to get you started in the right direction. Some project might also be in an early state and either won't have a build guide yet or one that isn't complete. Luckily, that's not the case for the Totem, which starts off with a list of all the parts needed for the build. That includes these standoffs required to hold the cases together, which were quickly found on Amazon, but getting the exact match took at least 2 attempts, with my first purchase not fitting as it should have. It might sound obvious, but make sure you buy exactly what is specified. Sometimes searches can yield multiple results with parts that look eerily similar to what you're looking for, but aren't. Having said that, I couldn't always abide to that rule either. Sometimes you have to make do with what you can get, which was the case for the batteries. Apart from the dimensions, the build guide didn't specify the exact model. After a bit of searching and reading through Reddit, I settled on the beautifully named ICP641414PE, which is a 3.7 volt and 85 mAh pack that fits nicely into the cavity of the Totem's top case. Apart from Amazon, AliExpress can also be a good place and is where I bought all the switches and reset buttons. Another option might be custom or ergonomic keyboard specific sites. They sometimes have common parts used in these boards on hand and ensures that you actually get the right ones. If it is possible for you, and especially if you're doing this for the first time like myself, I would also highly recommend you get spares of everything. Chances are unfortunately that you might break your first PCB during the initial attempt. Specialized parts like the Seat Studio shower board I ordered directly from the source, but this too can be found on other sites as well, with the availability changing depending on where you're located. For example, the diodes I acquired from a local electronics shop, and the screws were purchased in person at a mechanical keyboard shop in Tokyo I visited a few weeks ago. Anyhow, next up were the parts that needed to be manufactured, and to my surprise, this process was a lot easier than I initially thought. All the files needed can once again be found on GitHub. Let's start with the case, which for the Totem was located in the aptly named case folder, and then ble/step for the Bluetooth version that I'm building. In the folder is also a handy little README file that will have a few recommended places on where to have this made. Now, if you own a 3D printer yourself, you're probably familiar with the next steps and are already off to the races. I do not, so I just followed the README and uploaded everything to jlpcb.com, a popular site where apart from 3D prints, you can also order PCBs and even commission CNC machining, but we'll talk about that at the end. Sorry for the interruption, everyone. Editing cheese here. I just realized that I kept saying JLPCB instead of JLCPCB in this entire video. So just ignore that. I'm gonna be saying this a lot, but just ignore it. Alright, back to the program. After uploading the files, you can select the method as well as the material. Following the README, I picked SLA resin and the JLC black resin for the material. I believe you can select other materials as well, including those with different color options, so you're not forced to using black if you don't want to. The JLC black resin I picked feels pretty solid. It has a nice soft touch feeling to it, but is very prone to greasy fingertips, which is unfortunate as I also picked it for the keycaps, but more on that in a second. Prior to manufacturing, I did receive a mail from JLPCB informing me that the files provided could result in problems as some of the walls were too thin. Since I had absolutely no idea how to adjust that and followed the guide which even mentions JLPCB as a 3D printing partner, I just told them to ignore it, and as far as I can see, the parts turned out great. A little side note on the just mentioned keycaps. If you do this too, you will have to order each cap individually. If you choose the lame ones like me, which I shall call them henceforth, you need to first decide how many of each type you want. I ordered 20 tilted, that's 5 for the top and 5 for the bottom row on each side, then 10 normal ones, 5 on each side again, 2 homings, again both sides, that's the ones with the little markers for my index finger so I can orient myself around the board, and lastly 6 tilted saddles for the thumbs. This should be just enough for both halves, but you can of course order some spares as well. I took the opportunity and ordered an entire MX set for my unicorn as well, which I've been using to write this script. The material, however, will start to shine pretty fast, so keep that in mind. Next up is the PCB or PCB, since we're dealing with a split here, and yes, you probably already guessed it, we can use JLPCB again with files from the same GitHub page, this time in the aptly named PCB folder. What we need is a zip archive, aka Gerbers, or however this is pronounced.
Mit dem Gerber darf ich's wagen. Gerber, für gutes Fondue.
This can be directly uploaded to JLPCB, where it gets processed, after which you should see a really nice 3D preview. make sure to once again follow the README file, which can be found in the same folder as the Gerber, to get the correct settings. I have to admit it felt a bit daunting at first seeing all these options, as I didn't know what any of the configurations meant. I ignored most of them unless they were mentioned in the README. Where I did have the freedom of choice was with the color, where I went with white, as I thought it would look cool having a bright contrast to the darker outer shell. But I later also found out that it's quite prone to highlighting your soldering skills, which in my case isn't something I want to be highlighted. There's also a minimum order quantity of 5 pieces with JLPCB, which I was happy to comply with as I wanted spares anyway, you know, just in case. An additional side note here, even though JLPCB seems to have different storefronts for each production type, separating 3D printing from PCB or even CNC machining, it is possible to order everything at once, which is very convenient. It is what I end up doing to save a little on shipping. Lastly, we have these switches. This is likely the most common part, and with the Totem being a chalkboard, I just picked these sunsets that I already had. Depending on the board, you'll also need some feet. I found this transparent sheet of rubbery buttons on Amazon and I'm pretty happy with it. This pretty much concludes the procurement. To summarize, follow the detailed list of parts found in the build guide and make sure you order the exact parts specified. Buy spare parts if possible, so it's okay if you mess up, and commission the 3D prints as well as the PCBs and double check the specifications with the provided README. If the keycaps are part of the project as well, make sure you order the right amount for your board. Alright, after that it's a waiting game until everything arrives, and then the real fun part starts. I'll be honest with you, I've soldered maybe 5 times in my lifetime, so when I first got the diodes for the Totem and saw how small and how many there were and how closely they had to be together, I had a small but notable stroke. By comparison, the solder points for the hot swap sockets seemed almost gigantic. The same goes for the power and reset switch. But the microcontroller? Yeah, that's where the real nightmare fuel is housed. But let's start with the easiest part first, installing the ZMK firmware for the wireless version on said controller. You don't have to necessarily do this first, but as per build guide, it ensures you actually have a working one. Just plug it in by USB-C and double-click the tiny, minuscule reset button. This will put it into bootloader mode and make it appear like an external drive in your system, which in my case was macOS. You can once again go to GitHub, this time into the firmware folder, where you will find 2 subfolders, one for QMK and one for ZMK, which is for the wireless version that I'm putting together. Simply download the 2 UF2 files, one for the left and one for the right half. Another side note here, these will also come with a default key map for the Totem. Now, for anyone doing this, you probably want to have your own mapping, but I think getting into that topic would make this overly long video even longer. So for now, let's stick to the hardware building, but I'll link some other guides down below if you want to know more about this. Anyway, simply drag the firmware for the left side onto your microcontroller, which should still be visible as an external drive. It will then automatically realize what it needs to do and install it, as well as disconnect to the disappointment of my OS. After this, you should see the Totem in the list of pairable devices. In the case of macOS, it even recognized it as a keyboard and wanted me to identify its layout. But since there are no keys attached to this thing, I'm going to have to leave macOS in the dark. For a while at least. You can repeat the same process for the right half, with the right file of course, but you won't see it show up via Bluetooth, probably because it later connects through the left. Having installed the brains, we're finally off to this soldering station, where I have a few notes before we start. As mentioned, this is probably the 5th or 6th time I'm soldering, and therefore my skills are lackluster at best, but I do have a few tips I learned after doing this, but I'd also take these tips with a grain of salt. As per usual, I'm hoping someone in the comments will pitch in and offer some more tangible help, and more importantly, what I can do better. That being said, starting with a good soldering iron is key. I used to have a really cheap one, which wasn't cut out for the job. Luckily, a friend of mine with a beard lent me their Pine Cell, which is this tiny display-equipped iron that was super easy to use. Then you of course need some soldering wire, a cleaning station, and very importantly, flux. Now, this is a freaky substance. It'll essentially remove oxides and impurities from the metal surfaces and results in a much easier soldering process. For tiny, small areas, flux can help a lot, like for the microcontroller for example, which is what I would start with. On my first attempt, I began with the diodes and the hot swap sockets first, thinking those would be the hardest. Oh, how I was wrong. The controller turned out to be my Achilles heel, and in the battle for joy, I somehow ended up bricking it. So I started from scratch again. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't just reheat the joints and use solder rig to remove the controller and add a new one, well, that's a very good question. I guess we'll never find out. Anyway, don't forget to add flux to the back of the controller too, especially this fantastic spot here, because this is where we'll have to do some super annoying soldering later. Then I used heat-resistant tape to fix the microcontroller to the PCB as it's super slippery, after which I picked the lucky first joint and heated it up. Loaded a tiny amount of solder to the tip of my iron and finally bonded them together forever. I do not know if this is the best way of doing this, but after a few attempts it seemed to work the best. Unfortunately, you have to repeat this step 27 more times, 13 on this side and another 14 on the back. But that's not it. Then it's time for the fiddly nightmare fuel factory, that is the cavity here. I guess if you're a dentist by day, this must feel like a walk in the park. I'm not. This felt more like being at the dentist. Honestly, I'm not even sure I did it properly. I kind of feel like this is the culprit of all of my problems, which I'll get to later. If you survived this though, I'd recommend a little test just to make sure the controller is still kicking. I simply plugged it in and as soon as I saw the Bluetooth signal, I was relieved. The diodes were next. Here it is crucial that they face the right way, with the line pointing towards the same direction as the arrow. I then took some flux and added it to one of the pads on the PCB, loaded the iron again, but this time touching the pad first before doing anything else, essentially dropping my load. I then took a diode, placed it, heated the previously dropped solder and watched as the two became one. This approach was also highlighted in the build guide and made the soldering of these diodes much easier than I had anticipated. After adding all 19 of them, it was time for another test, but now that they were in, I was able to check the actual keystrokes instead of just an arbitrary Bluetooth signal. Like with other PCBs, I used a pair of pliers to connect each switch socket while observing with increased excitement the individual lights going up in VIA. Then it was finally time to do the hot swap sockets. Here too it was crucial to place them in the right direction. They have one single corner which is not rounded that matches to the silhouette on the PCB. Like the markings of a murdered person, it needs to be returned to the scene of the crime. I once again used the same process: flux, pad, socket, heat. Then it was time to test again, but this time using real switches. At this point my anticipation was at an all-time high as everything worked as it should have. The reset and power switch were next, with the power switch following the familiar formula of flux, solder switch and heat again. While the reset button was old school, with the pins going through the PCB before getting this solder treatment as well. Once again it was time to test if everything was still working. If you double tap the reset button, it should put it into bootloader mode, and if it does, it means success. The power switch obviously doesn't do anything yet, so I turned it off and picked up the last soldering part of the day, the battery. The red cable went into the plus and the black into the minus sign on the PCB, after which I began praying. For the final test I tried wired first, which was successful, but upon unplugging the board, flicking the power switch, no signal, no Bluetooth, no nothing. Discouraged, I tried to find the culprit, but decided to move on with the case for the time being as the anticipation was simply too high to see the totem completed. Everything fit together snugly apart from the reset switch, which needed a bit of trimming at the pins even though the bottom case has tiny little cavities for it. The case itself is held together by these little standoffs and two screws on either side pulling each half together until they become one. Then came the feed and finally the switches along with the keycaps, some of which have difficulty committing to the totem. And that's it. Here it is in its full glory. If only it still worked. During one of my numerous testing sessions, the totem unfortunately slid off my table and held on to its dear life by the USB-C port. This must have loosened some of the soldering joints on the microcontroller because I lost connection on the top two rows, but a little pressure and some heat remedied those issues. In general, if you have problems with certain keys, I'd say the culprit, at least for me, was always the microcontroller, not the switch sockets or the diodes, which is what I believe to be the source of my battery issues as well, which in the end I never got working. I even tried using a different battery, one I part-picked from another board, which ensured me that it was working and fully charged, but to no avail. I do think that resoldering the controller might help, because I can't think of any other areas that could be the cause. But I don't think you want to see me go through that, and I also think this video is long enough already. For the 6.34 people still watching, it's time to wrap this up. In retrospect, I think I tried to chew off more than I could swallow for my first fully self-assembled keyboard. I should have gone wired only, or even picked an easier board with no casing at all, even if that wouldn't really change this outcome. This is also something I would recommend if you're doing this for the first time, unless of course soldering and working with electronics is a familiar territory. Alternatively, there's also the pre-built route. There are plenty of shops or even Etsy that'll sell you ready-to-go totems or a pre-soldered PCB if you'd like to dabble with 3D printed cases but don't want to deal with the hassle of hot electronics. The same goes for the keycaps. There are shops that'll sell you pre-printed ones. Of course, not everything can be acquired this way. Some parts can only be custom ordered, which is part of the allure in the first place if you ask me. Even though mine isn't working, wirelessly at least, I had a lot of fun doing this for the first time. The entire process, from picking a board, trying to find the exact parts, down to the anticipation and reveal of the 3D printed cases, felt fantastic. If you have the time and enjoy tinkering, I'd highly encourage you to try and build a keyboard that, for the lack of a better term, was downloaded from the internet. This is also just the tip of the iceberg. I briefly mentioned it, but JLPCB also does CNC machining, meaning yeah, they make aluminum parts, and I did dare to submit the exact same files to see what would happen, and lo and behold, a metal totem was born. It's a little less detailed as the machining wasn't able to recreate everything, but it is amazing nonetheless to have the ability to commission something like this, or an entirely transparent case like the ones seen in the build guide. You might wonder about the cost of this entire journey, and I think it really depends. The aluminum version will set you back way more, with over $70 for each half. The rest of the parts were relatively affordable, but there are both cheaper and more expensive pre-built totems out there. But again, I think building one, despite my inability to do so, is one of the most fun parts of this whole thing. Then there's the whole customization part, changing these designs to fit your needs and desires. The vast sea of options is tantalizing, but so is the thought of an entirely new creation, but those are stories for another time. For now, I hope this little journey of mine was helpful to someone out there and also fun to watch. I also would like to thank a friend and work colleague of mine that helped me with desoldering and stayed late at the office so I could go home and record this voiceover in time. Thank you, B. I really appreciate it. I hope the next video won't take as long and will feature a ball, a pen and thoughts. Many thoughts. Thank you again for watching and see you in the next one. Bye.
Mit dem Gerber darf ich's wagen. Gerber, für gutes Fondue.